Right now, while you are watching this, a foreign government owns a piece of your paycheck. It owns a slice of the company your boss works for. It owns a fragment of your retirement account, whether you have one or not. And here is the twist that nobody is talking about. That government represents just 5.5 million people. Norway, a country roughly the size of New Mexico. And its sovereign wealth fund, the world's largest, now valued at nearly $2 trillion, has quietly accumulated over $750 billion worth of American stocks alone. Apple, Microsoft, Nvidia, Amazon. They own a meaningful piece of all of it. Here is the question I want you to hold in the back of your mind for the entire length of this video. If a small Nordic country of 5.5 million people could pool its national resources and become one of the single largest investors in American corporations, why does nearly half of the American workforce have no access to any employer-sponsored retirement plan whatsoever, leaving their effective retirement floor at virtually zero? That gap between a nation that built the world's greatest savings machine and a nation that is running on financial fumes is exactly what we are going to unpack today. And the answer is going to challenge almost everything you think you know about wealth, government, and who actually owns the future of this economy. Chapter 1. The ownership reality. Let's start with what is actually real. Norway's government pension fund Global, commonly called the Oil Fund, currently holds approximately $1.92 trillion in assets. That number crossed nearly $2 trillion in late 2025, driven largely by the artificial intelligence-fueled tech rally that benefited the fund's enormous positions in American technology companies. To put that figure in perspective, it is larger than the entire GDP of Australia. It is bigger than the combined market capitalization of every listed company in South Korea. And according to the latest filings from Norges Bank Investment Management, roughly 52.9% of that fund is invested directly inside the United States, spread across equities, bonds, and real estate. That means Norway holds well over $900 billion worth of American financial assets. Think about what that includes. The fund owns approximately 1.26% of Nvidia, the company whose chips are powering the artificial intelligence revolution you keep hearing about. It holds more than $50 billion worth of Apple stock. It carries comparable and substantial positions in Microsoft, Alphabet, and Amazon. When Nvidia's stock price moves by 1%, Norway's fund gains hundreds of millions of dollars. Passively. While Norwegians sleep. Now compare that to the American worker sitting across the table from that reality. While the median 401k balance for those who actually have an account sits at around $30,000 to $35,000, that figure obscures a far more uncomfortable truth. Approximately 42% of full-time working Americans have no access to an employer-sponsored retirement plan of any kind. For those workers, the effective retirement floor is not $30,000. It is zero. Not inadequate. Yes, it is zero. And the workers who do have access to a plan frequently undercontribute or cash out early, meaning the median balance across the entire workforce, not just active participants, tells a far grimmer story than the headline 401k figure suggests. And this is where it gets truly unsettling. Norway owns a piece of America's future. And a significant portion of Americans do not even own their own. Chapter 2. How they built the machine. Here is where the story gets genuinely fascinating. Because the origin of this fund is not what most people assume. And I want to address that misconception directly, because you have probably heard some version of it. The common assumption when people talk about Scandinavian countries is that everything great about their system comes from high taxes. And yes, Norway has high taxes. But the oil fund itself was not built on taxes. It was built on oil. Specifically, on a decision made in the 1970s and 1980s that was almost unprecedented in modern economic history. Norway discovered oil under the North Sea in 1969. It was a massive find. And at that moment, the government faced a choice that virtually every oil-rich country in history has gotten catastrophically wrong. The choice was simple in concept but brutal in discipline. Do we spend this oil money now, or do we save it for the future? Look at what neighboring countries did. Look at what Venezuela did. Look at what certain Gulf states did before they implemented their own funds. Oil money pours in, political pressure mounts, governments spend, the oil eventually runs out, and the country is left with nothing to show for the resource that was pulled out of the ground. Norway looked at that pattern and deliberately chose a different path. In 1990, the Norwegian government formally established the fund. The rule was elegant in its simplicity. Every single krone of petroleum revenue that came into the government's hands was deposited directly into the fund. The government was then allowed to spend only the equivalent of 3% of the fund's value per year, later adjusted to around 3 to 4%, to support public services. That discipline transformed what could have been a temporary oil boom into a permanent, compounding national endowment. Here is the second layer of genius that most people miss entirely. The fund was explicitly prohibited from investing inside Norway. Every single investment had to go abroad. But to prevent the Norwegian economy itself from overheating. If the government had pumped that money into domestic real estate and domestic businesses, it would have created runaway inflation. Instead, they sent the capital out into global markets, let it grow, and structured a mechanism to bring returns home slowly and sustainably. And the largest single destination for those global investments became the United States. So when you hear that Norway's oil fund owns American companies, understand what that really means. It means Norway took a non-renewable natural resource, converted it into a permanent financial one, and deployed that financial resource into the heart of the world's most powerful economy. They are not taxing their way to prosperity. They are compounding their way there. And they are doing it in large part inside your stock market. Here is a genuine question I want you to answer in the comments right now. The United States generates trillions of dollars every year from natural resources, oil, natural gas, federal land leases. If Congress had redirected just 20% of federal mineral rights revenue into a sovereign wealth fund starting in 1990, where do you think that fund would stand today? Would you trust your government to manage something like that responsibly? Seriously. Tell me below. The conversation there is always better than I expect. Chapter 3. The American Retirement Freefall. Let's turn the lens directly on the American side of this equation now. Because the data here is genuinely alarming, and it does not get the attention it deserves in mainstream financial media. Start with access. Approximately 42% of full-time American workers have no employer-sponsored retirement plan available to them at all. That is not a matter of personal financial discipline. That is a structural absence. You cannot contribute to a plan that does not exist. For those workers, the retirement safety net consists of Social Security alone, a program that was never designed to be a primary income source but has, for tens of millions of Americans, become exactly that. For workers who do have access to a 401k, the median account balance sits at around $30,000 to $35,000 across all active participants. That sounds modest on its own. But it sounds catastrophic when you compare it to what retirement actually costs. Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, the largest asset manager on Earth, stated publicly in his most recent annual letter that you need approximately $2 million to retire comfortably in today's environment. He has also pushed forcefully for rethinking the traditional retirement age entirely, because the current system is simply not generating outcomes that allow most Americans to stop working when they expect it to. $30,000 against a $2 million target is not a gap. It is a chasm. Now let's do the comparison that this channel exists to make. In Norway, every single citizen carries a theoretical stake of approximately $349,000 in the Sovereign Wealth Fund, based on the fund's current valuation of $1.92 trillion divided across a population of 5.5 million people. A Norwegian child born today is born with access to a $349,000 national savings position, backed by the best-performing equity markets on Earth, managed by professional investors, and compounding over the arc of their entire lifetime. They never had to contribute a single krone directly. The nation's natural resource revenue did it for them. The structural difference is not simply about generosity. Norway did not build this fund by being more compassionate. They built it by being more strategic with a public asset. American oil wealth went largely to private companies, shareholders, and executives. Norwegian oil wealth went into a public fund that every Norwegian citizen co-owns. The mechanism was a political choice. And the downstream effects of that choice are now measured in trillions of dollars. Quick pause here, because if the math we just walked through is making your brain buzz, that means you are exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. Nexora is built around one core premise, that there are systems operating in the world right now that produce dramatically better outcomes than what most Americans experience, and that understanding them is the first step to building a better life for yourself and your family. If that mission resonates with you, hit subscribe right now. You will not get motivational fluff here. You will get the actual math every single time. Now, let us keep going, because the myth we are about to bust is one that I know is already forming in the back of your mind. Chapter 4, The Myth Buster. Right about now, a specific objection is forming in your head. I know it, because I have seen it in the comments on every single video in this series. The objection sounds like this. Sure, Norway has this amazing fund, but Norway is a small, homogeneous country sitting on top of an ocean of oil. This could never work in America. We do not have that kind of resource. Let us dismantle that argument with actual numbers. The United States is, in fact, the world's largest oil producer. It surpassed both Saudi Arabia and Russia in output. The federal government collects billions of dollars each year in royalties, leases, and revenues from oil and gas extraction on federally owned land. The Interior Department alone collects billions annually in petroleum-related revenues. Alaska, which operates its own version of a sovereign fund, the Alaska Permanent Fund, has distributed direct cash dividends to every one of its residents every single year since 1982. In 2025, that dividend was $1,702 per Alaskan resident. No application required. No means test. Every resident. Every year. Alaska essentially proved the model works inside the United States. They just never scaled it to the federal level. The second version of this myth is the claim that Norway's results are purely about oil luck, that any country sitting on a North Sea oil field would have built the same fund. That argument ignores the discipline completely. The United Kingdom also extracted massive quantities of North Sea oil starting in the same era as Norway. Britain had access to the exact same geological windfall. The British government chose to spend that revenue on tax cuts and operating expenditures during the Thatcher era, rather than saving it in a sovereign fund. Today, the United Kingdom has no comparable sovereign wealth fund. Norway has a nearly $2 trillion one. Same oil field, different political decisions, radically different outcomes for citizens. So the myth is not that Norway got lucky. The myth is that luck is the primary variable. The primary variable was discipline and political will. And if you think those are qualities that are genetically Nordic and therefore unavailable to Americans, I would point you directly to Alaska, which has been running its version of this experiment successfully inside the United States for more than 4 decades. I want to ask you something very specific here. Alaska has been writing annual checks to its residents from an oil-funded sovereign fund since 1982. That is a real, domestic proof of concept that has now paid out dividends for over 40 consecutive years. So if Congress introduced a federal version of the Alaska Permanent Fund tomorrow, one that sent every American adult a direct annual dividend from national resource revenue, would you support it even if it meant those energy corporations paid a larger share of extraction royalties to fund it? Think about it carefully, and write your actual answer below. Not just yes or no. Tell me what your condition would be. Chapter 5. What Norway's ownership actually does to you. Let's move into something that almost nobody discusses in this conversation, which is the real-world behavioral difference that this kind of wealth architecture creates between Norwegian society and American society. Because the gap between these two countries is not just financial. It is psychological. It is medical. It is measured in stress hormones and sleep quality and years of healthy life. When you know that your nation has a nearly $2 trillion savings cushion growing on your behalf, when you know that a functioning public pension system is waiting for you at retirement, that healthcare will not bankrupt your family, and that the government is genuinely acting as a fiduciary for your long-term well-being, you make different decisions. You take creative risks in your career. You start businesses. You take parental leave without terror. You invest in your own health because you are not rationing care by cost. The psychological weight of financial precarity in America is not just an abstract concept. It is a measurable drag on human productivity and health outcomes that shows up in population-level data. Norway ranks number 1 in the Natixis Global Retirement Index for 2025. The United States ranks 21st. And the specific areas where Norway outperforms are not complicated. They score better on financial security, health outcomes, and material quality of life in retirement. But what makes the gap even more striking is the mechanism behind it. Norway is not just redistributing wealth from the rich to the poor. It is compounding public wealth and distributing the returns across the entire population. That is a fundamentally different kind of economic engine. Meanwhile, in America, the stock market has generated extraordinary returns over the past several decades. But because stock ownership in the United States is so heavily concentrated among the wealthiest households, those gains have overwhelmingly flowed to the top of the wealth distribution. The top 1% of Americans now hold approximately $52 trillion in wealth. The bottom 50% holds a fraction of that combined total. The stock market grew. Almost all of that growth went to people who were already wealthy. That is not a flaw in capitalism. That is a structural consequence of who owns capital in the first place. Norway built a mechanism for collective capital ownership. America mostly did not. And the downstream result is that a country with 5.5 million people now owns $1 trillion stake in the engine of the American economy, generating compounding returns every single day, while tens of millions of American workers enter their 50s with a retirement account balance that would not cover 6 months of living expenses. That is not a coincidence. That is a system operating exactly as designed. Here is where I want to be direct with you. The reason this channel exists, the reason we do this specific kind of research, is because these comparisons are not meant to make you feel bad about being American. They are meant to show you that a different set of outcomes is genuinely possible because we have real-world evidence that it has already been achieved. That is the entire thesis of Nexora. If you are watching this and you feel the friction between the life you are working toward and the systems that make that work harder than it should be, then this channel was built for you. Then subscribe. Join that conversation. I will be in the comments for the first 2 hours after this video drops to answer your specific questions on the math. That is a standing offer. Chapter 6. The hidden math nobody runs. Let us close by running the number that should genuinely stop you in your tracks. Norway's fund grew by 15.1% in 2025 alone. It generated approximately $247 billion in a single calendar year. For a country of 5.5 million people. Then run that math. $247 billion divided by 5.5 million citizens equals roughly $45,000 of investment return generated per Norwegian citizen in 12 months. Before any of them worked a single day. Before any of them filed a tax return, clocked in at a job, or made a single financial decision on their own behalf. Now think about what the average American family earns. The median household income in the United States sits at approximately $77,000 per year. That means Norway's Sovereign Wealth Fund, purely from its annual investment returns, is generating gains per citizen that are equivalent to more than half of what the median American household earns by working full-time for 12 months. The Norwegian fund is not a safety net. It is a second economy operating in parallel to the real one, compounding silently, growing larger every year, and distributing its benefits to every Norwegian citizen regardless of their education level, their job title, their employer, or their zip code. And here is the detail that brings this full circle back to the open loop we established at the very beginning of this video. Remember the question we started with? Why does nearly half of the American workforce have no access to an employer-sponsored retirement plan, while a small Nordic country built the world's greatest savings machine? The answer is not that America lacks the resources. The United States is the world's largest oil producer. It sits on trillions of dollars in federal land assets. It has the deepest and most productive capital markets in human history. The answer is that America made a series of political choices, over several decades, about who should own the returns from its most valuable public assets. Those choices overwhelmingly directed public resources toward private hands. Norway made different choices. And those choices are now sitting in the form of a $1.92 trillion fund that holds a commanding stake in your economy, generating $45,000 per citizen per year, growing every single day, while the median American worker heads toward retirement with an account balance that Larry Fink himself has described as nowhere near what anyone actually needs. That is not a coincidence. That is a system operating exactly as designed. What comes next? The Norway versus America conversation does not end with a sovereign wealth fund. The next video in this series goes one layer deeper. We are going to look at what Norway actually does with those returns when they hit the domestic budget, and why a Norwegian college student pays zero tuition while an American graduate enters the workforce carrying an average of $37,000 in student loan debt. The mechanisms are directly connected. And once you see the full architecture, you cannot unsee it. That video is already live, and the link is right here. And here is your question of the day, because this is the one I genuinely want to see you debate in the comments section. If the United States converted its federal oil and gas royalty revenue into a sovereign wealth fund starting tomorrow, and every American adult received an annual dividend check from its returns, would you be willing to give up the possibility of those resources going toward lower gas prices in exchange for a guaranteed payment that grew every single year for the rest of your life? Would you take the check, or would you take the cheap gas? Leave your answer below. I will be reading every single one. At Nexora, the data exists. The comparison is real. The question is whether you are ready to